guys, and welcome to Lizzie Dean Makes. Today we are doing a mini series on how to get into web development and how the web works as a whole, and where you can go to get more resources on how to learn to code from scratch. So I just finished a video which I will link to in the description box below, which gives a bit of an overview of how the web actually works, what it is, and what it does when you actually type in a web address in your browser and what that actually means. So today I want to talk about 3 separate parts of a web page and how a web page works in today's world. So these 3 parts that I want to talk about are purely front end. So we're not talking about saving anything to a database or talking to other services or anything like that. We're just talking about a simple web page. There are 3 sort of key components that I want to look at. So those are CSS, HTML of course, and JavaScript. So we touched last time on what an HTML document is. So like you've got a Word document, or you've got an Excel document like a spreadsheet, an HTML document being just another type of document. So in order to create and edit an HTML document, all you really need is what's called a text editor. So on your computer you've probably got something called Notepad, or if you're working on a Mac you've probably got something called WordPad, or you might download something a bit more in depth like Notepad++. And that is like Microsoft Word or like Microsoft Excel. It's just a piece of software that allows you to open, create, edit documents of different file types. In this case we're talking about HTML documents that you can just edit completely openly on the page. So when you open an HTML document, it's essentially a series of different elements in angle brackets. So at the beginning of the document it might have !doc type, and this is just saying that it's an HTML document, and that's declaring that in HTML5. Under that you might have a head section and a body section within an HTML tag. That's purely saying that for this HTML page, here's the head and here's the body. The head section contains things that are required, dependencies that are required to go with this web page, or instructions on what to do with this web page. So when the browser loads up your HTML document, it goes through the things that are in the head section first and it executes them. That could be bringing in another file that contains CSS, or the styles of your web page that tell it what fonts to use, what size text to use, and so on. It could also be going and getting some JavaScript from a JavaScript file that does something a bit more in depth. So we'll talk about JavaScript later on, but the head section might go and get some other documents that are required. It might also have some CSS or some JavaScript in line within a style tag or a script tag at the top of the document there, that it will execute straight away at the beginning of the page load. It will then move on to the body section and it will begin to render those elements visible on the page. So the head section mostly wants to contain information about what to do with the document and what are the resources to use when rendering the body, and the body section is the thing that you actually see on the page. That body section might contain some textual elements or some images or something of that nature, which is what you would see on the web page. So these are also things in angle brackets, and there are different types of element that relate to different types of thing within the web page. So you might have a P tag, which is for a paragraph of text. You might have an H1 tag, which is for a top level heading. You might have a IMG tag, which is for an image element. And you might have maybe some A tags, which are for hyperlinks linking you from one HTML document to another, which are what we know as links on the internet. That's essentially what an HTML document is. It describes the layout of these elements in very basic terms, from top to bottom, and it can include additional information that talks to other things like the CSS or the JavaScript, saying this is X, Y, Z, one of these. So if you've got 5 different paragraph tags, P tags, on the body of your page, you might give each of those a different ID, and you might want to have the CSS apply just to one of those IDs and not to all the other P tags. That's all within the HTML markup specification. So the very first thing that you want to learn when learning about web development is to get your head around creating an HTML document and the various things that make up an HTML document. There are a huge number of resources online for getting to grips with HTML. YouTube is a fantastic tool, but there are also plenty of blogs and tutorials on the web which can talk you through this in more detail. HTML is used in conjunction with, as I said, CSS and JavaScript in most web pages, most modern web pages. In the early days, you might have just had HTML, you might have just had HTML and a bit of CSS. JavaScript came along later and has grown and grown and become a much larger part of the web environment. The CSS to HTML is the styles that apply to your HTML, and CSS stands for cascading style sheets, which essentially means that you can have multiple different CSS files, and it will read the top first and then the next one and then the next one and then the next one. And if the very bottom level, which is the last to be read up, overwrites something that came earlier, that will have precedence, and that's why it's called cascade, because it goes down through them and it applies the most recent one further down as the overriding one. These styles can be things like colours, fonts, whether to make something italic or bold, but they can also be things like creating beautiful gradients, like a sunset colour on a button from red through blue, or creating rounded corners on a button, or deciding that you're going to put a border around something. That's essentially what the CSS cascading style sheets do. They take either the element name, like P for a P tag, or they take IDs or classes which you've applied to specific elements within your file, and it then applies those styles to them, and it takes the last one as the priority style. In a nutshell, that's what CSS is. There are various tools, resources, tutorials on how to use CSS and how to get started with it. It's very simple to get started with CSS. There are 3 key ways of doing CSS that it's worth noting. The first is that you can write CSS styles directly into the element, and this is known as inline CSS. So if you've got a P tag, you can write angle brackets P and then a space and then style equals and a pair of quotes, and inside those quotes you can write some CSS that applies directly to that element on the page. The next type of CSS is called internal CSS, and this means that in the head section of that HTML document you can put a style tag, and you can put in that style tag for P, this is the style you want to use, and that will then apply to all of the paragraph elements within your HTML file. And that's known as internal CSS because it's happening within that same document. That's opposed to inline CSS, which is happening in line with a specific element in the actual HTML. This is all happening up in the head section usually, but within a style tag, and that's known as internal. The third way of doing CSS, which is most commonly agreed to be the best practice way if you're doing larger projects, because it scales much better, and that is to do external CSS, which is where you have a completely separate document with the file extension .css. You can also create this in any text editor, and this document contains just styles. That document is then inserted as a link in the head section of your HTML page, so that when it's loading its dependencies, things that it needs in order to make this web page display on the browser, it will say, oh, and with this HTML document you need to use this CSS, and it'll go and get that CSS and apply it as it's running through the code and displaying that HTML page in the browser. So that's a basic overview of what CSS is and the different ways of doing it. As I said, there are plenty of resources online. If you Google how to get started with CSS, there are Udemy courses, there are resources on W3 Tools, there's plenty of answered questions on Stack Overflow, and there's just loads and loads of blog posts, tutorials, YouTube videos. There are plenty of resources. So the first thing you want to learn is how to create an HTML document, and the second thing you want to look at is how to style your HTML document using CSS, inline, internal or external CSS. The third component of most modern websites is JavaScript. JavaScript is a scripting language for HTML documents. A scripting language essentially means that it acts. While HTML describes the layout and CSS describes the style, JavaScript isn't so much describing as acting upon those things. So in JavaScript you can set up functions. Those functions can occur on different triggers. So the first trigger is that when the document is loaded, then it executes, and this is the document ready trigger. You might also have functions that execute on click. So if you click on a p tag, you can write a function that executes when someone clicks on a p tag. There are other events that occur within a web page, so when an image has finished loading, or when someone hovers over a certain element, and you can set these events up and have functions that execute on those events. What is a function? A function is essentially doing something with an input and giving an output. It doesn't necessarily have to have an input put in as a variable. It can go and look things up using those classes, IDs, or the element tags themselves to go and find something that it's going to then execute. So for example, if you have a script that runs when the document is ready, and it goes and it gets the p tag, it can apply a class to that p tag saying use CSS style X. That's one thing that a JavaScript function could do. You could also have a function that when you click on a certain paragraph, it jumps you to another paragraph elsewhere on the page, or it opens up the body of the description underneath that little paragraph that was just the sort of teaser trailer. There are various things like that that you can get JavaScript to do. JavaScript is very, very powerful because it can be tailored to suit what it is you want. So depending on what function you write, it can do pretty much everything on the web within that HTML document. That is the interactive element of websites. So when you go on a website and you're interacting with things, you are triggering events by clicking on things, by hovering on things, by pressing things on your keyboard, and you are then shown different things or interacted with in a different way depending on what you've done based on the JavaScript functions that are existing within that code. As with CSS, you can write JavaScript that is inline, so you can have within the actual HTML element, you can have something that's on click, and then you can have in the quotes on click equals, and then in the quotes you can have some JavaScript that will execute when someone clicks on that specific thing. You can also have JavaScript that is written in a script tag, usually in the head section, but it could be in the body section, and that script tag could contain a function that explains what event it's tied to, when it should execute. Should it execute immediately on page loading? Should it wait and execute when someone clicks on something or interacts in a certain way? You can also have external JavaScript files that you include as a script with a link in that points to a JavaScript file separately with a .js file extension that you've created and saved somewhere else, and you can have a link that goes and gets that as a dependency at the beginning of the page load. So just like with CSS we had inline, internal and external, you can have the same levels of JavaScript as well. That's the basis of the information that you would want to start learning if you're learning to code. You want to be able to create an HTML document. You want to be able to style it up using some CSS, either inline, internal at the top, or external in a separate file. And you want to be able to create some JavaScript functions that interact in some way with some event that's happening on that page. And you can do that inline, internal or external as well. That is the basis of web development. I hope you found this interesting. If you have, then please do remember to give it a thumbs up. And I am going to do another video in a moment, which I will also load onto this mini series, which is going to cover, once you've created your HTML, CSS and JavaScript, how you can interact that with other HTML files or other resources on the web using something called HTTP. So that's the next video that I'm going to upload. Thanks for watching, guys.